November 18, 1860. Omaha, Nebraska Territory, 693 miles west of St. Louis. Population 4,000, maybe 5. The sky hangs low and gray over the Missouri River, and the air smells of ice forming in the shallows. Edward Creighton stands at the edge of town, 40 years old, a surveyor's transit case in one hand, a leather satchel of maps and financial instruments in the other. He wears a heavy wool coat against the coming winter. Behind him, a Concord stagecoach waits, its 6 horses stamping in the cold, breath clouding. Ahead, nothing but prairie rolling west into territories where the federal government's grip loosens with every mile, where Confederate sympathizers plot secession from Missouri to Texas, where the question of whether California will remain loyal to a fracturing Union hangs unanswered. Creighton climbs aboard. The driver cracks his whip. The coach lurches forward. Edward Creighton is about to embark on a survey that will nearly kill him. Over the next 3 months, he will travel more than 2,000 miles through winter storms, across mountains where temperatures plunge below zero, following immigrant trails and Pony Express stations through lands inhabited by Pawnee, Cheyenne, Sioux, Shoshone, and Paiute nations who have watched the westward tide with growing alarm. He will reach Salt Lake City by December, then push west alone on horseback, when no stage driver will take him farther. He will arrive in Carson City, Nevada in January 1861, frostbitten, snowblind, barely alive. But he will have mapped a route. He will have proven it possible. And by summer, crews will follow that route, planting 27,500 poles, stringing 2,000 miles of iron wire, racing to connect the Atlantic and Pacific coasts by electricity before the nation tears itself in two. This is not a story about manifest destiny or national mythology. This is a story about math, about logistics, about 4 months in the summer and fall of 1861 when construction crews worked 16-hour days in 100-degree heat and sub-zero mountain passes, hauling poles across treeless plains, negotiating with Mormon settlers for timber, convincing Pawnee and Shoshone leaders that the humming wire would not anger the spirits, bribing Confederate guerrillas to spare the line. It is about the moment when information finally moved faster than horses, when a message that once took 10 days by Pony Express or 110 days by ship in 1841 could cross the continent in minutes. When California Chief Justice Stephen J. Field could telegraph President Abraham Lincoln on October the 24th, 1861, assuring him of California's loyalty to the Union, and Lincoln could receive that message the same day, transmitted across mountains and deserts by electromagnetic pulses through a single strand of iron wire suspended on poles planted every 75 yards from Omaha to Salt Lake City to San Francisco. The line was completed just 6 months into the Civil War. It cost $500,000. It killed the Pony Express 2 days later. Within 5 years, Western Union, the company that built it, would control 90% of the telegraph traffic in the United States, a monopoly so absolute that Congress would attempt, and fail, to nationalize it. The men who built the transcontinental telegraph became rich. The technology they deployed was 17 years old, invented by an artist who turned to electricity because his painting career had stalled. And the route they chose, surveyed in the winter of 1860 by Edward Creighton, would become Interstate 80, the main corridor of American transcontinental travel for the next 165 years. This is the story of how the Wild West got wired. Before there could be a transcontinental telegraph, there had to be telegraphy itself. The technology was born not in the frontier West, but in the industrial East, in workshops and laboratories where inventors wrestled with the strange new force called electricity. By the 1830s, scientists in Britain, Germany, and America had demonstrated that electric current could travel through wires over significant distances, and that this current could be manipulated to send signals. The race was on to build a practical system. In England, William Fothergill Cooke and Charles Wheatstone patented an electromagnetic telegraph in 1837 using 5 wires and 5 needles to indicate letters. British railways adopted it quickly. In America, the champion was Samuel Finley Breese Morse, born in 1791 in Charlestown, Massachusetts. Morse was an artist, a painter of historical scenes and commissioned portraits, a founder of the National Academy of Design. He had no formal scientific training, but in 1832, returning from Europe aboard a ship, he fell into conversation with passengers discussing the new science of electromagnetism. One man mentioned Michael Faraday's electromagnet. Someone asked, "Could you send a signal through a wire?" Morse, 41 years old, his painting career financially unrewarding, seized on the idea. He spent the next 5 years developing a working telegraph. He enlisted help. Leonard D. Gale, a chemistry professor at the University of the City of New York, taught him the principles discovered by Joseph Henry at Princeton: how to boost a signal using relay systems, how to overcome distance problems. Alfred Vail, a young machinist and former student, joined Morse in 1837, refining the design, building better equipment, and likely contributing to the famous code of dots and dashes that would bear Morse's name alone. By 1838, Morse was demonstrating his system to members of Congress and President Martin Van Buren. The device was simpler than the British system, using only 1 wire and a receiving register that embossed dots and dashes onto a moving paper strip. Operators quickly learned to interpret the clicks by ear, never needing to look at the paper. Morse wanted the federal government to own and operate his telegraph. Like the post office, he argued it was a matter of national infrastructure, but convincing Congress to spend money proved difficult. The Panic of 1837 had plunged the economy into a long depression. Democrats in power opposed federal spending on internal improvements. Morse lobbied for years. Finally, in March 1843, Congress appropriated $30,000, about $1 million in today's terms, for an experimental line from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland. 40 miles. Morse had less than a year to build it. He tried laying the wire underground at first, using a special plow designed by Ezra Cornell, pulled by 8 mules, cutting a 2-inch wide, 20-inch deep trench. But after about 9 miles, the line failed. The insulation was defective. Too much time wasted. Deadline looming. Morse switched to the British method: overhead wires on poles. On April 1, 1844, crews began installing 23-foot chestnut poles spaced 300 feet apart along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad right-of-way. The work went faster. By mid-May, the line reached Baltimore. On May 24, 1844, in the old Supreme Court chamber in the Capitol building, before an audience of congressmen, Samuel Morse tapped out a message on his telegraph key. 40 miles away in Baltimore, at the B&O Railroad's Pratt Street station, Alfred Vail received it and immediately sent the same message back. The phrase had been chosen by Annie Ellsworth, daughter of the Patent Commissioner, "What hath God wrought?" A biblical quotation from the Book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse 23. Witnesses called it astonishing. One reporter wrote, "This is indeed the annihilation of space." Morse expected the government to buy his system and extend the line to New York. Congress refused. Lawmakers couldn't envision the telegraph as a profitable venture. Senator George McDuffie of South Carolina asked, "What is this telegraph to do? Will it transmit letters and newspapers?" In 1845, funding ran out. The government turned the Washington-Baltimore line over to private investors. Morse's dream of a federally owned system died, but his technology exploded. By 1850, telegraph lines reached every major city east of the Mississippi River. Private companies multiplied, competed, consolidated. Messages that once took days by post now arrived in hours. Stock prices, commodity markets, news dispatches, all suddenly moved at the speed of electricity. Financial centers like New York consolidated their dominance because information reached them first and fastest. And out in California, on the far edge of the continent, separated from the eastern states by 2,000 miles of plains, mountains, and deserts, people started wondering, when would the wire reach them? California entered the Union in 1850, the first state on the Pacific coast, its population swollen by the gold rush. By 1853, local entrepreneurs were building telegraph lines within California. The California State Telegraph Company connected San Francisco to San Jose, Stockton, Sacramento, and Marysville. By October 1860, a line ran all the way to Los Angeles. But California remained an island, telegraphically speaking. News from the east still came by ship around Cape Horn, 45 days from New York to San Francisco, or by overland stage, which took more than 20 days from St. Louis. When President William Henry Harrison died in April 1841, the news took 110 days to reach Los Angeles. By the late 1850s, Californians were demanding faster communication. Statehood meant little if the state couldn't coordinate with Washington. Business suffered from information lag. Political loyalty, especially as sectional tensions rose, required constant reinforcement. Enter the Pony Express. In April 1860, the firm of Russell, Majors & Waddell launched a mail relay service using horse-mounted riders to carry letters from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. 184 stations spaced about 10 miles apart. Riders changed horses at each station, covering the route in 8 to 10 days in summer, 12 to 16 in winter. The fastest recorded run, November 1860, carrying news of Abraham Lincoln's election, took 7 days and 17 hours. Revolutionary. The cost was also revolutionary, $5 per half-ounce letter at launch, later reduced to $1. Still expensive. Only the urgent and wealthy could afford it, and the Pony Express bled money. Maintaining hundreds of horses, stations, and riders across nearly 2,000 miles cost more than the service could ever earn. Russell, Majors, and Waddell knew it. They hoped federal contracts would follow. They also knew the Pony Express was temporary. The telegraph was coming. Congress had been debating a transcontinental telegraph since the early 1850s. Proposals piled up. The California legislature offered $6,000 a year in 1859 to any company that connected the state to the east. Then, on June 16, 1860, President James Buchanan signed the Pacific Telegraph Act. The federal government would pay $40,000 per year for 10 years to the first company that built and maintained a line from the western border of Missouri to San Francisco. The contract required completion within 2 years. Government messages would have priority, transmitted free of charge. Rates for commercial use would be capped initially at $3 from Missouri to California, though the act specified 30 cents per message for ordinary use once the line proved stable. Companies began jockeying for the contract. Theodore Adams bid. Benjamin Ficklin bid. John Harmon bid. Then, at the last minute, all three withdrew. Later, they would join the winning bidder. That bidder was Hiram Sibley, president of the Western Union Telegraph Company. Hiram Sibley was 49 years old in 1860, a machine shop operator and banker from Rochester, New York. In 1849, he'd tried to establish a printing telegraph company, but found too many small competitors. So he and his partner, Judge Samuel Selden, decided to buy them all. They acquired 11 telegraph companies operating north of the Ohio River, and in 1856 renamed the consolidated entity Western Union, signifying that the Western lines had been unified. Ezra Cornell, the engineer who'd built Morse's failed underground cable, was a major partner. Jephthah Wade, another consolidator, joined them. By 1861, through mergers and acquisitions, Western Union had become one of 6 major telegraph companies in the United States, and the only one with the capital and organizational reach to attempt a transcontinental line. Sibley was aggressive. When Congress authorized the contract, he was the only bidder left standing. He won by default. And then he faced the problem. Nobody knew if it was actually possible to build and maintain a telegraph line across the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Great Basin, and the Sierra Nevada. Timber was scarce on the plains. Water was scarce in the deserts. Native American nations, watching emigrant trains and mail routes multiply, had grown hostile to further encroachment. Confederate sympathizers in Missouri and Kansas were already threatening sabotage as Civil War loomed. Winter storms could take down miles of line in a single night, and the entire project had to be completed in 2 years, or the contract would expire. Sibley needed someone to survey the route, someone who knew telegraphy, who knew the West, who could endure hardship, who could negotiate with settlers and tribal leaders, who could evaluate terrain and timber resources and estimate costs with precision. He chose Edward Creighton. Edward Creighton was born on August 31st, 1820, on a farm in Belmont County, Ohio, the son of Irish Catholic immigrants. He grew up working the land, driving freight wagons, learning the practical skills of a frontier economy. By the 1850s, he'd become one of the largest telegraph line builders in the Midwest. He settled in Omaha in 1857, recognizing the city's strategic position at the edge of the plains. He married Mary Lucretia Wareham in Dayton, Ohio, on October the 7th, 1856. He was pragmatic, Catholic, pro-union, and vocally anti-slavery, a dangerous stance in a region where Confederate sympathizers held sway in parts of Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. His brother John would later raise Union volunteer regiments to fight in the Civil War. In the winter of 1860, Western Union paid Edward Creighton to survey a route for the transcontinental telegraph. Creighton left Omaha on November 18, 1860. He took the overland stage west along the Platte River, passing Fort Kearny, following the emigrant trails through Nebraska Territory into what would become Wyoming. The stagecoach rattled over frozen ground, through Julesburg, Fort Laramie, along the Sweetwater River toward South Pass. Creighton took notes. Mileage, elevation, timber availability, water sources, locations of Pony Express stations and emigrant road ranches that could serve as construction camps. He noted the treeless stretches of prairie where poles would need to be freighted from distant forests. He noted the passes where winter snows could bury a line for months. He reached Salt Lake City, headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, led by Brigham Young. The Mormon settlers controlled much of the Great Basin. Any telegraph line would need their cooperation. From Salt Lake City, Creighton faced a choice. He could turn back, call the survey complete, and recommend a route based on the stage road he'd just traveled. Or he could continue west through the most difficult terrain, to Carson City, Nevada, and then to San Francisco, completing a full reconnaissance of the entire route. It was December, winter in the mountains. No stage driver would take him. Creighton chose to go alone. He set out from Salt Lake City on horseback, following the trail of the Pony Express. The snow was deep. The weather was intensely cold. Temperatures dropped well below zero at night. Creighton suffered frostbite on his face. His vision began to fail. Snow blindness, caused by sunlight reflecting off endless white expanses. He rode on, through lonely valleys and across dreary plains, along precipitous mountain paths. After many fatiguing days, he reached Carson City. He was on the brink of death. Contemporary accounts say he arrived barely alive, frostbitten, unable to see. Local residents took him in. He recovered, and then he continued to San Francisco, where he met with California telegraph executives, including Jephthah Wade, who had been sent by Sibley to consolidate the small California companies into a single entity, capable of building the western section of the line. Creighton had found the route. He returned to Omaha, filed his report, and began preparing for construction. Hiram Sibley and Western Union organized two subsidiary companies to handle the actual work. The Pacific Telegraph Company, incorporated in Nebraska in January 1864, but organized in Rochester, New York on April 17, 1861, would build west from Omaha to Salt Lake City. Jephthah Wade was named president. Hiram Sibley was vice president. Edward Creighton was appointed general superintendent of construction. The Overland Telegraph Company, organized under the California State Telegraph Company, would build east from Carson City, Nevada, the easternmost point of California's existing telegraph network, to Salt Lake City. Horace W. Carpentier was president. James Gamble was superintendent. James Street was general agent. James Gamble was an experienced California telegraph builder, one of the men who'd strung the first lines in the state back in 1853. He was methodical, detail-oriented, a veteran of the challenges posed by California's mountains and deserts. In the summer of 1860, he organized supply trains to haul materials over the Sierra Nevada. The Overland Telegraph Company ordered wire and insulators from manufacturers in the east, shipped around Cape Horn to San Francisco, then freighted east over the mountains. Thousands of poles had to be sourced and distributed along the 600 miles from Fort Churchill, Nevada, to Salt Lake City. Timber was scarce in the Great Basin. Gamble made arrangements with local contractors, including Mormons who controlled forests near Salt Lake. Brigham Young agreed to supply 200 miles of poles for the eastern section of the line from Salt Lake west, a critical contribution. On the eastern end, Edward Creighton stockpiled materials in Omaha. Thousands of poles, shipped by rail and river from forests in Missouri and Iowa, piled up in Omaha freight yards. Creighton freighted them west by wagon along the route he'd surveyed, distributing them at intervals along the line from Fort Kearny to South Pass to Salt Lake. He hired crews, hole diggers, pole setters, wiremen. He negotiated with tribal leaders, offering gifts and assurances that the line would not harm the land. He made clear to settlers along the route that Western Union would pay for any assistance: timber, labor, food. And he set a deadline. The line had to meet in Salt Lake City by fall, before winter closed the passes. Both crews began work in the summer of 1861. The nation was at war. Confederate forces had fired on Fort Sumter on April 12th. By July, the first major battle, Bull Run, had shocked the Union with a Confederate victory. Volunteers were marching to war. The federal government was desperate to hold the Western Territories and California, whose gold and resources could decide the conflict. The transcontinental telegraph became a strategic asset, a way to ensure California's loyalty and coordinate military communications. On July 4, 1861, Edward Creighton's crew erected the first pole. The sources disagree slightly. Some say July 2nd, most say July 4th. The location was near Omaha, or perhaps Fort Kearny, depending on the account. What's certain is that by mid-July, crews were working west from Fort Kearny, Nebraska Territory, along the Platte River Valley. The system was organized like an assembly line. Surveyors marked the route. Hole diggers followed, using shovels and augers to excavate post holes every 75 yards. About 200 feet. Pole setters came next, raising the poles into position, tamping earth around the base. Finally, the wire parties strung the single-strand iron wire from pole to pole, attaching it with glass insulators to prevent the current from grounding. The poles were chestnut, or sometimes juniper or cottonwood, depending on local availability. They stood about 20 feet high, every 75 yards another pole. 27,500 poles by the end. The Western crew, led by James Gamble, began construction on June 20, 1861, from Fort Churchill, Nevada. Fort Churchill was a U.S. Army post established in 1860 to protect the Pony Express and emigrant routes from raids by Paiute warriors who had fought back against encroachment in the Pyramid Lake War. The Overland Telegraph Company's crews worked east, following the Pony Express trail through the deserts and mountains of Nevada toward Salt Lake City. Gamble later wrote an account of the effort. "The line was first measured and staked off," he wrote. "The hole diggers followed. Then came the pole setters, and next the wire party. Obtaining poles in the treeless expanses was the greatest challenge. As there was not a stick of timber in sight throughout the entire distance, it seemed a mystery how they were to be procured." Gamble's crews relied on contractors who knew the land, who could identify distant forests and haul logs across deserts. Water, too, had to be hauled for the crews and animals working in summer heat. In mid-July, crews on both ends were working simultaneously towards Salt Lake City. From the east, teams led by W.H. Stebbins and Edward Creighton advanced west through Wyoming Territory. From the west, James Street's crews advanced east from Salt Lake City, and James Gamble's crews pushed through Nevada. The pace was punishing. 16-hour days under the sun, thunderstorms that turned the plains to mud, rattlesnakes, mosquitoes, dust storms. Crews camped in tents, ate simple food, fought boredom and exhaustion. Some quit. Others were injured. But the work continued because the men were paid well, by frontier standards, and because the project had momentum, a sense of historic significance, and because Western Union had promised bonuses for speed. By July 25, 1861, newspapers reported that the transcontinental line had reached Middlegate Station on the Pony Express route, 75 miles east of Fort Churchill. By August 1st, the Eastern Line was projected to reach Julesburg in northeastern Colorado Territory, 200 miles west of Fort Kearny. On August 5th, 1861, the line reached Fort Laramie, Wyoming. Each day, a few more miles. Each week, another landmark. The telegraph advanced faster than most had predicted, faster than the doubters, including, initially, Abraham Lincoln, had believed possible. Difficulties mounted as crews reached the mountains. In the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada, terrain grew steep and rocky. Digging post holes in frozen or rocky ground required picks and pry bars. In the Great Basin, water sources were 50 miles apart. Supplies had to be hauled by ox teams across blistering desert. Tensions with Native American groups flared periodically. Some leaders saw the telegraph as a violation of treaties. Others were curious, even supportive. Crews demonstrated the technology, allowing chiefs at Fort Laramie and Fort Bridger to exchange messages over the wire. One account describes two Pawnee chiefs amazed to learn that their messages had traveled over the wires to beat them to a meeting place halfway between their locations. Western Union officials, aware of the propaganda value, spread the story that the humming wires carried the voice of the Great Spirit Manitou. It was manipulation, but it worked. Many Native American leaders agreed to leave the line alone, at least initially. Later, as hostilities escalated during the Indian Wars of the 1860s and 70s, the telegraph became a target, cut repeatedly by warriors determined to disrupt Army communications. Confederate sympathizers also threatened the line. In Missouri, Southern partisans attempted to cut the telegraph to disrupt Union military coordination. Western Union had to reroute sections of the line through Chicago to avoid sabotage zones. Edward Creighton himself was warned to stay out of southeastern Nebraska and northwestern Missouri, where pro-Confederate factions had issued threats against him because of his vocal unionism. His brother, John, working as a telegraph installer for the Union Army, strung lines between the War Office and mobile fronts, allowing Lincoln and his generals to coordinate in near real time. By October, both crews approached Salt Lake City. On October 17, 1861, the eastern section, built by the Pacific Telegraph Company under Edward Creighton's supervision, reached Fort Bridger in southwestern Wyoming, about 100 miles east of Salt Lake. Creighton sent a telegram to his wife in Omaha. In a few days, the two oceans will be united. The next day, October 18th, the line reached Salt Lake City. Brigham Young sent the first official message from the city, addressed to Jephthah Wade, president of the Pacific Telegraph Company, congratulating him on the completion of the eastern section. Frank Fuller, acting governor of Utah Territory, sent another message to President Abraham Lincoln. In the temporary absence of the governor of the state, I am requested to send you the first message, which will be transmitted over the wires of the telegraph line which connects the Pacific with the Atlantic states. Utah has not seceded, but is firm for the Constitution and laws of our once happy country. The message was reassurance. Lincoln needed to hear it. But the transcontinental line was not yet complete. The eastern section had reached Salt Lake City, but the western section, being built by the Overland Telegraph Company from California, had not. James Gamble's crews were still working east through the Nevada deserts and mountains. The terrain was brutal. The Sierra Nevada presented steep grades and deep canyons. Snowstorms had already begun at high elevations. Gamble's crews pushed forward pole by pole, mile by mile. On the evening of October 24, 1861, at 5:13 p.m. Salt Lake City time, the western section reached Salt Lake City. James Street, the Overland Telegraph Company's general agent, sent the first message from Utah Territory to California, addressed to company president Horace Carpentier, advising him that the line was complete. Less than 2 hours later, Brigham Young sent another message to Carpentier, congratulating him. The transcontinental telegraph was finished. Atlantic and Pacific were united by wire. A message sent from San Francisco to New York could now travel in minutes instead of weeks. Almost immediately, the new technology was tested with urgent news. On October 24th, the same day the line was completed, word arrived by telegraph from the East that Colonel Edward D. Baker, a former California politician and U.S. Senator from Oregon, had been killed at the Battle of Ball's Bluff in Virginia on October 21st. The message was forwarded to San Francisco. California learned of Baker's death within hours. In the pre-telegraph era, the news would have taken weeks by ship or Pony Express. The difference was profound. California was no longer isolated. The state could react to national events in real time. The very next day, October 25th, California Chief Justice Stephen J. Field sent a telegram to President Lincoln from Sacramento. The message was notable for its political content. Field, whose brother Cyrus Field would later achieve fame promoting the transatlantic telegraph cable, assured Lincoln that the transcontinental telegraph would be the means of strengthening the attachment which binds both the East and the West to the Union. Translation: California was loyal. The telegraph proved it. The message was received in Washington the same day. 2 days after the transcontinental telegraph was completed, on October 26, 1861, the Pony Express officially ceased operations. It had launched on April 3, 1860, with great fanfare. It had promised 10-day delivery from Missouri to California. It had captured the public imagination. Young riders, many in their teens or early 20s, racing across nearly 2,000 miles of plains and mountains, changing horses every 10 miles, defying weather and danger. Buffalo Bill Cody, Pony Bob Haslam. Famous names. But the Pony Express had never been profitable. It cost Russell, Majors and Waddell more to operate than they could ever recover in fees. The partners had hoped for federal mail contracts that never materialized, and now the telegraph rendered it obsolete. Messages that once took 10 days by horse now took minutes by wire. The cost was comparable. Eventually $1 per word for telegrams, $1 per half ounce for Pony Express by July 1861, but the speed was incomparable. The last Pony Express letters completed their journey in November 1861. The service was gone, but the legend endured. The transcontinental telegraph transformed American communication. Before October 1861, news traveled at the speed of horses or ships. A clipper ship from New York to San Francisco took 45 days if it sailed around Cape Horn. Overland stage from St. Louis to San Francisco took more than 20 days. The Pony Express, at its fastest, took 7 days and 17 hours, but the telegraph cut the time to minutes. Stock prices, commodity reports, political news, military orders, all suddenly moved at near instantaneous speed. Financial markets in New York consolidated their dominance because traders there had the fastest access to information. Newspapers could publish stories from across the country on the same day they were reported. The Civil War became the first conflict in which both sides could coordinate military operations in near real time using telegraph. Lincoln sat in the War Office telegraph room, reading dispatches from the front, sending orders to generals, shaping strategy with information that was hours old instead of days or weeks. The transcontinental telegraph was expensive. The total cost was $500,000, equivalent to roughly $17 million in today's currency, but it was immediately profitable. In the first week of operation, Western Union charged $1 per word. The Telegraph Act of 1860 had specified a maximum of 30 cents, but that cap applied only to routine use. Urgent commercial messages commanded premium rates. Businessmen, speculators, and financiers paid willingly. Within months, stock in both the Pacific Telegraph Company and Western Union skyrocketed. Edward Creighton, who held shares in both companies, became wealthy. Hiram Sibley, who'd staked Western Union's future on the transcontinental line, saw his gamble pay off spectacularly. By 1866, Western Union controlled 90% of the telegraph traffic in the United States, a monopoly so absolute that Congress attempted, unsuccessfully, to nationalize the telegraph and place it under the post office. The line itself was fragile. Inclement weather, lightning bolts, strong winds, heavy snow, damaged poles and wires constantly. Bison rubbed against the poles, sometimes bringing down sections of the line, an irony that contributed to the near extinction of the species. Native American warriors, recognizing the telegraph as a tool of U.S. military control, began cutting the wires in the 1860s as part of their resistance. In 1862, Lincoln requested that a Utah militia of 90 men, led by Captain Lot Smith, protect the line between Fort Bridger and Fort Laramie. Confederate guerrillas also targeted the line. Western Union had to reroute sections through Chicago to avoid sabotage in Missouri. Maintenance was constant. Crews patrolled the line, repairing breaks, replacing poles, adjusting wire tension. Operating the transcontinental telegraph required a permanent workforce and ongoing investment. But the technology worked. It proved that a communications network could span the continent, operating year-round, despite weather, terrain, and hostility. It demonstrated that a continental republic could be bound together by something faster than horses and more reliable than ships, and it laid the groundwork for the next phase of American infrastructure. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in May 1869, which followed much of the same route that Edward Creighton had surveyed in the winter of 1860. When the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads met at Promontory Summit, Utah, a more advanced multi-wire telegraph system was built alongside the tracks. The original 1861 line, which had operated for 8 years, was replaced, but the principle had been proven. Who were the men who built the transcontinental telegraph? They were not mythic figures of the Old West. They were engineers, businessmen, surveyors, laborers. They were practical men solving practical problems with existing technology. But their work had outsized consequences. Samuel F.B. Morse, the artist who became an inventor, lived until 1872. He never saw the full flowering of the communications revolution he helped launch, but he lived long enough to witness the transcontinental telegraph, the transatlantic cable, and the beginnings of a networked world. Without Morse's 1844 demonstration in the Capitol, without his persistence in securing federal funding and perfecting a simple, reliable telegraph system, there would have been no network to push west. Alfred Vail, his often overlooked collaborator who helped design the equipment and likely contributed to the code, died in 1859 before the transcontinental line was built. History remembers Morse. Vail is a footnote. Hiram Sibley, the Western Union president who won the federal contract and organized the transcontinental build, became one of the wealthiest men in America. He remained with Western Union through the 1860s, overseeing its rise to monopoly status. He died in 1888, having lived to see the telegraph displaced by the telephone, another communications revolution. Sibley was a gambler in the best sense. He bet Western Union's future on an untested project and won. He also understood that technology alone doesn't build infrastructure. Politics, finance, and logistics matter as much as invention. Jephthah Wade, who served as president of the Pacific Telegraph Company and helped consolidate California's telegraph industry, remained a major figure in telecommunications. He was a founder of Western Union and served as its president from 1866 to 1867. He invested heavily in railroads and real estate. He donated land in Cleveland for what became Wade Park, home to the Cleveland Museum of Art. He died in 1890. Wade understood the business side of telegraphy, the art of consolidation and monopoly, the value of controlling a network. Edward Creighton, who surveyed the route, led construction, and nearly died in the winter of 1860, returned to Omaha after the line was completed. He became president of the First National Bank of Omaha in 1863. He and his brother John invested heavily in the Union Pacific Railroad, which followed Creighton's telegraph route west from Omaha. Edward Creighton died on November 5, 1874, at age 54. His widow, Mary Lucretia Creighton, used his fortune to endow Creighton University in Omaha, which opened in 1878 and still operates today. The university bears the Creighton name because Edward's work on the transcontinental telegraph made him rich and locally famous. The route he surveyed in 1860 is now, for long stretches, Interstate 80. Millions of drivers follow Edward Creighton's path without knowing his name. James Gamble, who led the Western construction crews, is the least remembered of the four. He was a skilled telegraph builder, a veteran of California's early telegraph industry, a methodical engineer who solved logistical problems in difficult terrain. After the transcontinental line was completed, Gamble continued working in California's telegraph industry. The Overland Telegraph Company was absorbed into the California State Telegraph Company in November 1861. In 1867, California State Telegraph became part of Western Union. Gamble wrote an account of the construction effort for the Californians magazine in 1881, one of the few first-hand narratives of the project. He lived until 1905, dying at age 78, largely forgotten outside California. But without James Gamble's expertise in the Sierra Nevada and the Great Basin, the western section might have taken months longer to complete, and the transcontinental telegraph might have missed its deadline. These four men, Morse, Sibley, Creighton, Gamble, came from different backgrounds and pursued different goals. Morse wanted recognition as an inventor and hoped the government would adopt his system. Sibley wanted profit and monopoly. Creighton wanted to build something that mattered, and he succeeded beyond his expectations. Gamble was a craftsman, a professional who did the work that needed doing. Together, they wired the West, not because of destiny, not because of divine providence, but because the technology existed, the capital was available, the federal government provided a subsidy, and the political crisis of the Civil War made the project urgent. The consequences of the transcontinental telegraph rippled outward for decades. Economically, it accelerated the consolidation of American financial markets. New York became the undisputed center of commerce because New York traders had the fastest access to information. Prices for commodities, stocks, and bonds could now be transmitted instantly, eliminating the arbitrage opportunities that had enriched middlemen in the pre-telegraph era. Wholesalers and retailers became more tightly linked in a national economy. Railroads used the telegraph to coordinate train schedules, preventing collisions and improving efficiency. By the 1880s, telegraph lines ran alongside nearly every rail line in America. Militarily, the telegraph transformed warfare. The Civil War was the first major conflict in which both sides used electronic communication. Union forces, which controlled most of the telegraph infrastructure in the North, had a significant advantage. Lincoln could read dispatches from the front, consult with generals, and issue orders within hours instead of days. The Confederacy, with less developed infrastructure, struggled to match the Union's coordination. Telegraph operators became critical military assets, and both sides trained soldiers to build and operate field telegraph lines. The technology learned in the Civil War would be used again in every subsequent American conflict through the early 20th century. Politically, the transcontinental telegraph helped preserve the Union. California's loyalty was never a certainty in 1861. The state was geographically isolated, economically independent, and culturally distinct. Southern sympathizers were active in California, especially in the southern counties. If California had seceded or declared neutrality, the Confederacy might have gained access to Pacific ports and gold reserves. The telegraph allowed Lincoln and California's pro-Union leaders to communicate quickly, reassure each other, coordinate policy, and maintain political alignment. Stephen J. Field's telegram to Lincoln on October 25, 1861, the first transcontinental message from a major California official, was a deliberate political statement. It said, "We are part of this nation. The wire proves it." Socially, the telegraph changed how Americans thought about distance and time. Before 1861, the West was remote. News traveled slowly. Events in California felt distant, almost foreign. After 1861, the West was connected. An earthquake in San Francisco, a mining strike in Nevada, a battle with Native American warriors in Wyoming, all could be reported to New York newspapers the same day. The sense of a unified national consciousness began to form, mediated by the telegraph and the news industry that depended on it. The Associated Press, founded in 1846, grew into a dominant news wire service, distributing stories via telegraph to hundreds of newspapers. The telegraph created a shared sense of nowness, a feeling that events everywhere were happening simultaneously and could be known immediately. This was new, this was unprecedented, and it was profoundly disorienting to a population that had lived for generations at the pace of horses. Technologically, the transcontinental telegraph was a stepping stone. It proved that electronic communication over vast distances was feasible. When Cyrus Field and his partners completed the first successful transatlantic cable in July 1866, they built on the lessons learned in building the overland line. When Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876, the infrastructure of poles, wires, and relay stations established by the telegraph industry provided a ready-made foundation. The transcontinental telephone service, completed in 1915, followed the same routes and used the same networks. The Internet, a century later, would replicate the logic of the telegraph. A network of nodes, a distributed system, information moving at the speed of electricity. But there were costs. The telegraph accelerated the dispossession of Native American nations. The line itself was a symbol of American expansion, a physical manifestation of the federal government's intent to control the West. The poles and wires disrupted bison migration routes, though the impact was minor compared to the mass slaughter that came with the railroads. More significantly, the telegraph enabled military coordination that made the Indian Wars of the 1860s and 70s more efficient and deadly for Native American peoples. U.S. Army commanders could communicate instantly with Washington, request reinforcements, coordinate movements, and report victories. The telegraph didn't cause the Indian Wars, but it made them easier to prosecute. The environmental impact was also real, though modest by later standards. 27,500 poles meant 27,500 trees cut and hauled across the plains and mountains. Thousands of oxen and horses were worked to exhaustion freighting supplies. Camps and construction sites left scars on the landscape. But compared to the devastation wrought by the railroads, which clear-cut forests, dynamited mountains, killed millions of bison, and brought waves of settlers, the telegraph was relatively light. The poles rotted and fell over within a few decades. Some still stand today, weathered stumps in Wyoming and Nevada, markers of a nearly forgotten infrastructure project. By the late 19th century, the transcontinental telegraph was old news. The railroad, completed in 1869, captured public attention. The telephone, commercialized in the 1880s, began displacing the telegraph for personal communication. Radio, in the early 20th century, offered wireless transmission, teletypes, automated message sending. By 1990, Western Union, once the most powerful telecommunications company in America, had abandoned the telegram business entirely, surviving only as a money transfer service. The Internet finished the job, making even that obsolete for most uses. Today, almost no one sends telegrams. The technology is a museum piece, but the idea endures. The transcontinental telegraph was the first time information moved faster than people. It was the first time a continental nation could be administered in real time. It was the first time financial markets, news media, military operations, and political coordination operated at electronic speed. Every communications revolution since, telephone, radio, television, internet, mobile networks, has been an iteration of the same principle. Collapse distance, accelerate information, bind people together through technology. The transcontinental telegraph was the prototype. On the evening of October 24th, 1861, in Salt Lake City, James Street stood in the telegraph office and tapped out a message to Horace Carpentier in California. "Line complete," he wrote. "Come to the office." A few hours later, Brigham Young sent his congratulations. Messages flew back and forth. California to Utah, Utah to Omaha, Omaha to New York. The wires hummed. Electrons pulsed through iron strands stretched across 2,000 miles of wilderness. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln received a telegram from Stephen J. Field assuring him of California's loyalty. In New York, stock traders learned the news within hours and began speculating on the value of Western Union shares. In San Francisco, newspaper editors set type for morning editions announcing the connection. The nation, 6 months into a civil war that would kill 650,000 people, had just been stitched together by a single strand of wire. 2 days later, the Pony Express died. Riders turned in their horses. Stations closed. The romantic era of mail by horseback ended not with ceremony, but with obsolescence. Technology had moved faster. On the plains and in the mountains, the telegraph poles stood every 75 yards, a rhythm of infrastructure marching west. Crews would patrol the line for years, repairing breaks, replacing poles, fighting snow and wind and sabotage. The line would last 8 years until the railroad made it redundant. But for those 8 years, the transcontinental telegraph was the thread that held the nation together. Edward Creighton returned to Omaha. He'd survived the winter survey, the frostbite, the snow blindness. He'd supervised construction across nearly 1,000 miles of plains and mountains. He'd planted thousands of poles, negotiated with Mormons and Pawnee, coordinated crews, met deadlines. He became wealthy. He became respected. He died at 54, probably from complications of the hardships he'd endured. His widow founded a university in his name. His route became a railroad. His railroad became a highway. Millions of people follow that route every year, most of them unaware that they're tracing the path of a man who nearly froze to death in the winter of 1860 so that messages could travel at the speed of electricity. James Gamble returned to California. He continued building telegraph lines, working for companies that were swallowed by Western Union, living long enough to see the telephone replace the telegraph, dying in 1905 at age 78. He left behind a written account of the construction, a rare first-hand document. Otherwise, history forgot him. Hiram Sibley stayed in Rochester, managing Western Union, watching the company grow into a monopoly, fighting off competitors, consolidating power. He lived to see the telegraph become ordinary, ubiquitous, essential. He died in 1888, rich and largely remembered only by telegraph historians. Samuel Morse died in 1872, still famous, still celebrated as the inventor who'd launched the telecommunications age, though Alfred Vail's contributions were already being forgotten. Morse lived long enough to see his invention span oceans and continents, to see governments and corporations depend on it, to see the world shrink. The transcontinental telegraph was completed on October the 24th, 1861. The Pony Express ceased operations on October the 26th, 1861. Between those two dates, a technology that had existed for 17 years and a mail service that had existed for 18 months passed each other, one rising, one falling. The future arrived not as a revolution, but as an incremental improvement. Faster, cheaper, more reliable. The romantic image of riders galloping across the plains gave way to the prosaic reality of crews maintaining wire. The myth of the West, wild, untamed, distant, began to fade as the wire connected it to the rest of the nation. Messages that once took weeks now took minutes. Distance collapsed, time compressed. The annihilation of space, as the 1844 reporter had written. In Salt Lake City, on the evening of October the 24th, 1861, a telegraph operator placed a hand on the key and tapped out a message. Across the continent, in San Francisco, another operator heard the clicks and transcribed the words. The circuit was complete. The nation was wired.